Next week, the earnings are really going to start picking up over the next 2 weeks. But right now, this week, we still got a lot of financials and banks. Have Netflix at the close on Thursday. We've got Taiwan Semiconductor, same day, so we'll be watching the semiconductor ETF. And again, the semiconductors and NVDA begin to go down. So will the NASDAQ. Some warning signs. Watch the video all the way through and you will see them. This week we start getting some of the Wall Street darlings, and then we'll be moving into the Fed meeting 2 weeks from tomorrow. Quickly, I'm watching the VIX here. It got a black candlestick today. The Bollinger Bands are tightening. They may be tight for a little while. We'll see what happens, but we are getting our second close above the 50-period moving average. If we can get a surge in volatility, get back above the 200, you can get a sharp sell-off right here, right now. If we continue to kind of consolidate and maybe change the boundary or here, again, this can go on, and while might get some volatility, it may drag out into the Fed meeting. Watch this video all the way through, explaining what to be watching for surrounding the Fed meeting coming up and surrounding the pivot, and it happen in all likelihood in September. You're going to get a market top with that pivot or ahead of that pivot. I'll be talking about that. You might want to watch this video all the way through. Really important stuff to share with you. But I'll be watching the VIX. Earnings, S&P, again, I got two channel lines here. The black one excludes the shadow, and again, the red one includes it. And we have, again, we're coming up to that area right now, potentially forming a triple negative divergence here on the RSI. Got the same thing going on here with the MACD. You got a multiple point negative divergence, one in the most recent price action here. Watching, see if that begins to play out here at some point this week. These are the channels that I'm looking at, one including the shadow, one excluding it, and then again the black and the red upper boundary here. Just move my upper trend line. Sometimes when I hit save, the trend lines move here. Again, if I include the shadow, a little bit higher. If I exclude it, we're just right underneath it. But that red trend line parallel to this one, and then the black one, which we haven't reached. I've got a little frog in my throat here. We haven't reached it, and lose the shadow here. So I'm just watching these divergences. I'm watching the channel here. And if we flip over and look at momentum, again, this channel line, again, we're just directly below it. The other one would be a little higher, not on this chart. Again, you got a divergence going on here and this larger one here. So again, we'll be watching to see if that starts turning. S&P down. Again, NASDAQ is not making a new high. S&P is. They're diverging from one another at this moment. Watching to see if NASDAQ stops making new highs. If NVIDIA and the semiconductor ETF have peaked, good chance that NASDAQ has. I'll show you those charts shortly. So here's the divergence up close. And again, bull flag played out, and we've seen move up towards the channel line on the 60-minute chart. Talking about those channels for a while. We're forming this divergence. This is the S&P 60-minute chart up close. We're forming this divergence as we're right below that upper channel line. So I'll be watching that very closely. And again, MACD turning back up today, the very end here on the 60-minute chart. Again, I mean, this really nice looking divergence. They're forming. We're pushing up into the channel line I just showed you a moment ago. Down much of the day. It ended up flat, up 11 points at the very end of the session, rebounding. But again, S&P is diverging with NASDAQ. It's making a lower high, and it came right up here to after the CPI sell-off, came right up here to the 78.6 Fibonacci, and we turned down off of that. So again, as we move into earnings, can it recover or not, or does this high hold? That's why I'm paying so close attention to NVIDIA and to the semiconductor ETF, which you'll see those charts in just a couple of minutes. Even if we rally and don't get a higher high, we could still get, again, a larger move that looks like this. Just coming back up in here, establishing a lower high. So do keep that in mind. NASDAQ does attempt to rally. Tech will be watching, paying very close attention to NVIDIA and reversals that have taken place in the negative diversions with the semiconductors. Here are these daily charts. S&P, again, a rising wedge. If we look at the more recent price action, the divergence is forming here. Got a couple of topping tails, but they mean nothing unless they're confirmed. Today we have the rally into the just below the trend line here. And again, per channel of the 60-minute chart, that I've been talking about here. It's a rising wedge if we just take it from the more recent price action, the channel further back. CD still has not rolled over, did on the NASDAQ, but we do have this divergence that's forming on the RSI. Again, I'll be talking about, could be if we do start to sell off, that we get something that looks like this, where we come back down and either get a lower high or a higher high with the Fed right about there, or sell off something like that and go into the Fed, and then sell off NVDA and the semiconductors start tanking, then we could get a bigger sell-off right here, right now. But we'll be watching. Divergence is completing here on the daily chart. Bearish MACD crossed yesterday on the NASDAQ with the divergence. We don't have the breakdown. We tried to start breaking down below the 10 and below the trend line here. Again, this rising wedge in the daily time frame, but we couldn't do it. We've got a lower high, but again, the topping tails that we're getting, those candlesticks have not been confirmed. Just like on the semiconductors, we would have to see the semiconductors confirm them and then the NASDAQ do so. Again, I'll be watching to see, do we establish a lower high? Does NASDAQ diverge with the S&P, as so often is the case? MACD's rolled over. We'll be watching to see what happens. Again, we were flat for the session for NASDAQ, slightly higher. S&P had a gain. They're diverging from one another. Again, S&P is up near the upper channel. NASDAQ nowhere near it. I'll be watching. Do we attempt to make a new high? Or even if we go higher, do we get a lower high still and then turn down or attempt to go up towards that channel? We'll be watching surrounding earnings. Start to get the sell-off and weakness and warning signs. The CPI sell-off, but we've kind of gone sideways. Now, we got warning signs with the NASDAQ, but we seen the momentum shift. We tried to get a red bar with the doji yesterday, turned right back to green today. We ended up flat, up 11 points or so. Told you we had a divergence, but again, unless you see momentum flip, start seeing the weakness with NVIDIA and with the conductors, then we just go sideways. These signals so far have just produced a sideways move. We had the sell-off with the CPI, and momentum did not flip. Same thing here. And sideways momentum flipped briefly, but then we got red bars, and the momentum line turned red, but then it reverted right back to bullish. Couldn't flip the trend. Over here, same thing. Couldn't flip the trend. Over here, we're going sideways. So watching, do we break down or do we have to go back up? That's why I'm paying very close attention to NVIDIA and the semiconductors, which you'll see later in this video. I'm paying very close attention to the negative diversions on the semiconductors and the bearish engulfing candle to see if it's confirmed. See it shortly. Right now, momentum has not shifted. It's still green. The momentum line is still blue. Is this just a sideways move, or are we going to get something bigger later in the week? It's going to drag out into the Fed meeting. Semiconductors are doing the exact same thing, and I'll show you some other charts on the semiconductors. Exact same thing NASDAQ is doing. It's formed the diversions, and we've gotten some signals suggesting some kind of sell-off. We've started to see it, but again, we have not been able to confirm the bearish engulfing candlestick. That is a bearish engulfing. Whoops, sorry about that. But again, you've got the divergence with momentum and place on various indicators. We'll see if we start seeing the semiconductors break down. Momentum has not shifted yet with the semiconductors, and we have not yet confirmed the bearish engulfing, but you do have the negative diversions. We start seeing momentum start going negative, start seeing the trend change, momentum begin to turn bearish. We'll see further selling with NASDAQ, so I'll be watching. This is a semiconductor ETF daily chart. I wanted to take the time to show you in video because it did see momentum shift today. Would the NASDAQ and the semiconductors begin to follow? Now we got the little red arrow. We got the momentum line turning to red with today's bar. We sold off. We didn't close at the lows, and we slightly confirmed the bearish engulfing. You'll be able to see it on my other chart because here I have the bars reflecting momentum. Still have a green bar. We'll see if that turns red. Again, you got a lower high, warning signs of a top over here, warning signs of a top here. But we saw the breaking of the cloud, the sell signal, turning back to bullish here with it turning back up and setting up our lower high, and then the bearish engulfing surrounding the CPI sell-off last week. Background is now starting to turn to red. It did here, but we've got a lower high here, diverging with NASDAQ. The semiconductors have a higher high. You're watching, do we begin to see this momentum now spill over into the semiconductors, into the NASDAQ 100. Got to come down here to get a lower high and a lower low. I wanted to show you we are starting to see momentum start to shift with NVIDIA. We'll see if that gives us a sell-off later this week or not. In a moment, I'll be showing you some powerful charts. Make sure you watch the video all the way through. And momentum signals for the S&P are still bullish. My signals remain bullish. They have to see momentum flip and then the trend signals change if we're going to get any kind of sell-off. Warning signs here, but we only went sideways. Here we're getting the start of some warning signs, but the bars are still green, reflecting bullish momentum, and the momentum line is still blue. We do have a negative divergence here, and again, forming another little one in the more recent price action as we're going up and moving to the upper channel on the 60-minute chart. Now, I want to continue to point out, I personally believe we're going to get our first rate cut in September. At the moment, Fed Fund Futures is seeing the same thing. They're betting on a September cut. I think that will be correct. The central bankers around the world have already begun to cut. This was at 100% this morning. Right now it's at 89.6 for a September cut. It's also betting just under 60% that we get a second cut in November and a third cut in December. 3 cuts a year. Now remember, previously we were at 3 cuts penciled in with the Fed estimate, but they revised it. I told you that was going to happen. They revised it. I told you it was going to go down to a revision of 1 or none. Went down to a revision of 1. Earlier in the year, the betting markets here with Fed Fund Futures, they were expecting 7 cuts. That was unrealistic. Right now, this is likely going to be the case that we'll get 2 or 3 cuts 2024, and it will likely be before the election. Had that hot PPI report, but we had a cool CPI inflation report, what Powell really focused on, and again, recession. So the hot inflation report not going to lead to higher rates, but it's going to be dealt with the recession. The Fed needs a recession to resolve the inflation problem. The takeaways from Powell's Q&A is that he's going to lower rates before, they're going to lower rates before 2%. It's likely going to be wrapping up the summer, moving into the fall here in September. On September 18th, I believe we'll get the first cut. Highly probable the stock market will peak before that cut or surrounding that cut, more than likely before that cut. Over the weekend, I showed you all the recession warning signs. Powell has expressed concerns about the weakness with the labor market, even though the Labor Department's fudging the numbers, and they know that. See the revisions going on, but again, concerns about that, less concerned about the inflation, telling us he doesn't see a hard landing. He doesn't see a recession coming. The Fed knows there's a recession. He can't come out and say, oh, yeah, we're going to have a recession and the bear market's going to happen. He can't come out and rattle markets. So he has to say stuff like this, but he knows a recession is coming. Just telling you, look, there's a high probability we're going to get the first cut in September. There's a very good chance the stock market peaks before then and starts the bear market. NASDAQ may have already done that because, again, there's a very good chance NVIDIA and the semiconductors have already peaked or are peaking and in this topping process right now. It's going to weigh on the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ struggled today. Well, the Dow and the S&P was up, and the Dow was helped out by a couple stocks on earnings, and it was way up. Still slamming into that long-term trend line I've talked about. 125-year-old trend line. Dow slamming right into it. Back and testing it. Semiconductors and NVIDIA. We had the semiconductors get a bearish engulfing, turn down to the 20, rebound back up, again turning off of the upper Bollinger Band, coming back to the upper Bollinger Band, getting another bearish engulfing to form this divergence here, and the divergence on the MACD here with that RSI divergence. And today it started to sell off, but it rebounded to confirmation line of the bearish engulfing. If we can get confirmation of it, like I'm watching on NVIDIA, you can see a bigger sell-off for the NASDAQ. It is very possible the NASDAQ has peaked if the semiconductors have peaked with this divergence, and if NVIDIA has peaked with the lower high. Semiconductors moved to a higher high, NVIDIA got a lower high. NASDAQ moved higher without NVIDIA moving higher. They diverge from one another. That could be a huge red flag. So, and even with today's rally, NASDAQ was weighed down by NVIDIA. So again, here is, and we're getting a red bar, by the way. This is the semiconductor ETF SMH in the daily time frame. So again, I'm watching this confirmation line, watching to see if we take out the 10 and 20. We're resting right on the 10 here. Tried to take it out today. It failed, but you've got these divergences. So I'll be watching. If these begin to show weakness, the semiconductor ETF, NVIDIA, in the NVIDIA's daily chart, we start seeing weakness with it, can weigh on the NASDAQ 100. The semiconductors and NVIDIA show the same weakness with NASDAQ. Again, NASDAQ's being weighed down by that weakness that we're seeing. We're seeing these red oscillator bars, and as I said, as we move closer to the Fed meeting, I'm watching. Are we going to start seeing this go negative, okay? Or are we going to start seeing green bars here? And this is the semiconductor ETF daily. It was down, and then it recovered today, and it pretty much closed flat. Still above the 10 period. Are we going to start seeing this turn back up and still end up, trying to challenge those highs? The candlestick, the bearish engulfing, has to be confirmed, and so far it hasn't. You got to confirm it, and then you got to start taking out the moving averages and take out the 50, the 10 and 20 drop below it, and then come down here, take out the 50, take out the trough low between the two peaks to have the diversions play out. So again, maybe it just confirms a lower high. But if we don't confirm by getting a flip in momentum here, then again, watching NASDAQ, hang in there until the Fed meeting, or do we start seeing the weakness here? And again, weakness with NASDAQ. Which is it going to be? So if these daily charts start showing signs of strength and not confirming the bearish engulfing, NASDAQ can hold up. NASDAQ, it broke down a week ago, back up a test of the 78.6 Fibonacci. It sold off on the CPI last week, up a lower high. But again, if these start showing weakness, then so will NASDAQ. If they don't, then NASDAQ won't. Just over 2 weeks away from the Fed meeting. So we'll be watching to see what happens here. Do we get further weakness or not? The semiconductor ETF daily chart, I'm watching to see, do we get a reversal? Whoops, sorry about that. Do we get a reversal of conditions with momentum shifting, dropping below the cloud to below the 10 and 20 period moving average? Now, one thing I am watching, we have these red bars, and they may just go negative, or we may get green and may attempt, even if we get green, it still may just set up a lower high. We are getting red in the weekly time frame, which is interesting. We'll see if we close out the week that way with the semiconductors. Here, the MACD and the awesome oscillator have both moved to new highs, but you're getting a red bar. So again, just something to be watching. The topping tail week with the semiconductors. So again, just watching these things, because again, if they continue to show strength, then NASDAQ will. If the weakness that we've now begun to see, if that starts to play out, bearish engulfing and the topping tail here last week, then again, further weakness with NASDAQ if we confirm that bearish engulfing on the semiconductor. Same thing with NVIDIA. NVIDIA, again, the awesome oscillator MACD moving to new highs in the weekly time frame. Again, topping tail last week in the weekly time frame, getting a red bar. Will we close that way? This could go away by the end of the week if we see signs of strength. We have some tech earnings that may help. It happens just like the semiconductor ETF. Same thing here with the daily chart with NVIDIA. Again, you're getting the red bars. Do we start seeing green appear, or does this start going into the negative region? Do we get the reversal of conditions? And as what I'm telling you, look, we've started to see some weakness with with NASDAQ, but we need to see more. We're going to see more. You've got to get the weakness with the reversal of momentum here with NVIDIA, with the reversal of conditions, and with the semiconductors. I'm showing you, again, in the weekly charts, and those bearish divergences on the semiconductor ETF, on the MACD and the RSI, and again, the bearish engulfing candlesticks that formed at the Bollinger Bands here, the upper boundary, and then turned off of them. So again, do we set up a lower high and then get further weakness and confirm this bearish engulfing? It's not confirmed yet. Candlesticks are meaningless unless it's confirmed. Or do we attempt to go back up? Diversions is we have the bearish engulfing, but the reversal is not yet confirmed because we haven't confirmed the candlestick and taken out the 10 and 20. We tried to do it today, take out the 10 period today, and we ended up bouncing. So we'll be watching the semiconductor ETF SMH, and then look at NVIDIA. And why I'm showing you these is because the NASDAQ heavily influenced by the semiconductors, even more so by NVIDIA's stock price. NVIDIA's performance. Here is NVIDIA's daily chart. NVIDIA's daily chart, it peaked June 20th. I'm watching to see, does that peak hold? NASDAQ just moved to a new high and diverged with NVIDIA. We have a potential lower high that could be sitting up on NVIDIA and a divergence with the semiconductors and with the NASDAQ. We got a bearish engulfing here with a rising wedge. We broke down from the rising wedge with the bearish engulfing. We back tested, and today we had a sell-off. We tried to validate bearish engulfing. We did it ever so slightly. Not a decisive break, but we did break it for what it is worth. Video was down 1.62%. It was down over 2% at the lows of the session, but it rebounded back up off the lows. It still confirmed that candlestick. You need a confirmation of follow-through, and it's going to have to take out this low and move back to the 50 period to to test it or take it out if we're going to establish a lower high, lower low for NVIDIA. Now again, this is a stock that the NASDAQ has been following. This head and shoulders pattern, I've shown you this chart. I've changed, because we've gone sideways, I've changed the angle of descent for this possible head and shoulders. And again, we won't know unless we start coming down to move back towards the 200 period moving average and take out the 50 and the 100. The angle of descent going into late July could go into August, even into the September Fed meeting, September 18th. You get a summer sell-off, we'll probably get a rebound. Counting the Fed pivot, probably going to be very short-lived. Either you get a lower high with it in the market and here with NVIDIA, or again, we turn with the pivot, one or the other. My guess is we're going to peak and begin to turn before all likelihood. This is likely coming in September. So before September, the stock market is likely going to peak and begin to sell off, or at least there's a pretty good chance that that's going to be the area that plays out. And if so, NVIDIA could peak, and could NVIDIA be giving us warnings? If NVIDIA has peaked here, got a good shot at that playing out. We're starting to see those red awesome oscillator bars. We start selling off. If we end up getting a lower high in the weekly time frame with those awesome oscillator bars, it may be that we validate a top right here, right now. Watching, do we get the lower high, lower low, and start seeing NVIDIA begin to sell off and start moving back towards the 75 area, 75, 76 area here? If we do, the 200, again, is just getting above that area. We can throw back towards the 200, probably overthrow it, move towards it to tag it if this scenario can play out. We're going to get the FOMC meeting on the 31st, so I'll be watching. Do we start to sell off here or not? Do we confirm lower high, lower low? I'll be watching the semiconductors. NVIDIA's getting a lower high. The semiconductor ETF is getting a divergence, a higher high. Indicators making a lower high. So again, just say this, the herd believes that the Fed pivot is bullish. My video from the weekend, I showed you the recession indicators. I showed you that the Fed pivot is bearish. Institutions go on the financial channels and say that and give the herd plenty of Kool-Aid to drink while they sell into the rally. To see the distribution happens every time, but you've got, again, in the financial channels and Powell the other day in his Q&A, everybody, oh, no, there's going to be no recession. We're seeing the weakness. Go watch the video I did over the weekend. I went through the recession indicators. We're seeing the evidence now starting to come. It's going to be very, very soon. Powell's concerned about the labor market. At the point you're going to start seeing negative numbers, even with them fudging the numbers. Fudge them and make them look better, but you're still going to have negative numbers. You're going to start seeing that before the recession hits, the Fed pivot before the recession hits, likely a stock market peak, and the beginning of a bear market, all likely before the recession hits. So again, I can do something like this right here. Again, we'll see if we start getting a big sell-off right here, right now, or if we, do gradually move towards the Fed meeting 2 weeks from now. Talk about the bounce real fast. Might see surrounding a Fed pivot, which again I believe is going to be September 18th, which again could form a possible head and shoulders here. Or what could be is, and let me change it here and show you, is that we bottom out going into the FOMC meeting. We rebound with it, and get a lower high and maybe set up this pattern. Again, no guarantee this head and shoulder sets up, but it's just a possibility if we start selling off and getting a summer sell-off. I'll be watching. But again, either get a bounce with the rate cut or it could form a peak as I had with the other scenario. But let me just want to show you what happens before we get the rate cut. Historically, and these are the last two, the pandemic was a self-imposed shutdown, so I'm going to skip that. Show you the last two real bear markets that we had. Here in 2000, we had the pause, okay? We had already peaked in 2000, March of 2000. We got the pause in May of 2000, a couple months later. We ended up selling off, and then we rallied back up after the pause, which we're doing right now. We ended up forming a double top. We got a lower high by August. Some volatility in the summer, but then we set up a lower high in August, started to sell off going into the Fed pivot. The Fed pivot means they start cutting rates if you don't know already. Pause is when they stop raising them. That's why it goes flatlined. So we sold off sharply. And by the way, this is an election year. We're being told right now there's no way the stock market can go down, Bitcoin can go down because this is an election year. 2000 was an election, and we saw a sell-off. 2008 was an election year, we saw a sell-off. Both of them were presidential election years, didn't stop the market from having a significant sell-off. Both of those cases, even with the pandemic, that was an election year in 2020. Why we didn't get it is because they threw so much stimulus at situation with the Fed, QE infinity and beyond, and 5 or 6 trillion there in stimulus checks. Nevertheless, I digress. We had a sharp sell-off of about 20%. What people use to define a bear market, but have sell-offs greater than 20% and still be in a longer-term bull market. We've seen that pandemic where we dropped 35%. Nevertheless, I digress again. Sold off into the Fed pivot. The Fed did the pivot January after peaking in August. Okay, started the summer sell-off. It spilled over into the fall, on into January, the new year of 2001, and we had the Fed pivot. The market sold off into December here and rebounded briefly with the Fed pivot to January. On January 3rd there, we rebounded for about 2 weeks. Another lower high, and then right after that, the bottom fell out of the stock market after that rate cut, followed by more, this whole bear market. So again, that was the bear market. But we got initially, we sold off into the Fed pivot. We got a little bit of a bounce with it. This could happen. Herd believes that the Fed pivot, the Fed's going to cut rates and everything's going. Now we're really going to go, and it's going to create a top in the stock market. They're cutting because a recession is coming. Fed rates elevated, so all these people, us how bullish it is, they're going to say, well, the Fed should have listened to me. Kept rates too high for too long. That's going to be the narrative that I talked about. People on the financial channels are going to say, oh, the Fed should have listened to me. We have a recession. The indicators are predicting it. Go watch the video. I'll link again at the end of this video, my recession video. Through the indicators, and there are more. I just went through a handful of them. Warning, a recession is right around the corner. The financial crisis in 2007, we peaked, we sold off, and we went back up, and we made a higher high in October of 2007. In 2007, October. Right before that, the Fed did the pivot. Again, on September 18th, we peaked a couple of weeks later, just right after that. Now here you've got a higher high and a peak surrounding the Fed pivot. Here you've got a lower high and a sell-off going into the Fed pivot. Here we initially rebounded with the pause, but then sold off. Here we had a big move up, but some volatility along the way. Eventually, again, got the higher high. So again, I'll be watching to see how it unfolds. But with this Fed pivot right here in September, right after that, in early October, we peaked just a couple of weeks after the rate cut, and this followed. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, so the rate cut, the pivot is bearish. Okay, the question is, are we going to get a peak in the market as we go into the rate cut? We can get a sharp sell-off. Look at the sharp sell-off we had right here. Again, The volatility with the pause, we had a sharp sell-off, but then a rebound, and we actually went higher. I'm watching those negative divergences on the weekly chart and the monthly chart right now. I'm telling you, this is what's going to follow. And the herd is telling us no possible way that happens, no possible way a recession happens. We're in a brand new bull market. And again, we had the sell-off in 2022. The bear market, they told us that sell-off was not going to happen. The same people that are telling us that we're in this brand new bull market that's going to go on to 2027. When the Fed cuts rates, this happens. When the Fed cuts rates, this happens because they're cutting because of an economic slowdown and of a recession. Saying we're about to get a Fed pivot. I believe it's going to be in September. Here it was in September. Again, the market began to sell off and then go back up, or it could just begin to sell off going into that pivot and again get a feeble rebound. Here we had a rebound going into the pause and then peaked right after that. So that's usually how it works. Either you get the peak surrounding the Fed pivot or prior to it. But here again, we had both of these peaks long before we ever get that pivot. Which way will play out this time, we'll be watching. But usually you get it, the stock market peak ahead of the Fed pivot, be right now with the Fed pivot, which could be in September. I believe they're going to cut in September. We'll see how it unfolds. And even if we don't get the peak right now, it could be something like this, where you get a sharp sell-off and then a rebound back up. We'll continue to monitor the weekly RSIs, other indicators like the MACD. They already have divergences. Maybe they end up forming another one. Weekly time frame, if we get a scenario like this, should we start getting a big sell-off? But just something worth paying attention to. And again, here you got a lower high, here you got a higher high. We'll see which way it plays out here. Sell off into the Fed pivot, sell off, and then get a rebound like we had in 2007. Pause is very similar to the pause we have right now, where we've had this move up, but we've had some volatility along the way. Might get a lot more volatility because, again, look right here. The distribution started over here. If we went back up, we tested that high, moved just slightly above it, and then more distribution. So the distribution was already beginning ahead of the Fed pivot. So keep that in mind. But wanted to take the time to show that to you.